What if the person you trusted most was the one who planned your ultimate downfall? Imagine waking up one Sunday morning, expecting the usual quiet, the comfort of family, the warmth of home, and instead, finding horror so complete it shatters everything you thought you knew. This is exactly what unfolded in the sprawling Brentwood estate of Rob and Michelle Reiner, a tragedy so chilling that it has left both authorities and the public reeling. At 78, Rob Reiner was known for his sharp wit, his entrepreneurial spirit, and his devotion to his family. Michelle, 70, his partner and confidant, was the calm anchor, the quiet center that held the household together. But on that fateful Sunday, their lives were violently cut short in a manner so brutal, so intimate, that it immediately pointed to the unthinkable. This was not a random crime. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Police reports reveal that the bodies were discovered by Romy, their 27-year-old daughter, a detail that would later prove to be critical. Romy's first words to law enforcement were unnerving in their clarity, a warning about a dangerous family member who should be considered a suspect. Already, the narrative twists. This is no ordinary murder investigation. We are now looking at a home, a family, and a tragedy that hides secrets beneath its polished exterior. The mere notion that a child might be implicated in the murder of their own parents is enough to send shivers down anyone's spine. But there is more, much more, that would emerge over the following hours and days. The Reiners' Brentwood estate is no ordinary home. Valued at a staggering $13.5 million, it is a mansion that speaks of wealth, comfort, and security. Yet wealth does not shield one from tragedy. In fact, it often magnifies it. Within its walls, an unimaginable scene awaited investigators. The lifeless bodies of Rob and Michelle, stabbed in a manner that suggested both rage and precision. And then there was the guest house, home to their 32-year-old son, Nick. Nick's proximity to the crime scene, combined with Romy's pointed remarks, made the authorities consider a horrifying possibility. That the perpetrator was not an outsider, but someone who lived under the same roof. Imagine the psychological landscape of that morning. Romy, a daughter, stumbling upon her parents' bodies. The fear, confusion, and heartbreak that must have gripped her. What goes through a person's mind in that instant? How does one begin to process grief while simultaneously recognizing a potential family member as the culprit? This is not a story of distant strangers. This is a story of bloodlines, of shared history, and of trust betrayed in its most intimate form. And as the initial shock subsided, the investigation began to peel back layers of the Reiner family life that few outside observers could have anticipated. Authorities quickly moved to secure the scene, and it didn't take long for suspicions to zero in on Nick Reiner. The decision to arrest him came swiftly, fueled not only by physical evidence, but also by Romy's testimony and the unsettling details emerging from the crime scene. For most of us, the very notion that a family member could commit such an act seems unfathomable. Yet, history tells us that in cases of extreme domestic violence and family disputes, tragedy often strikes from within. The Reiner case, however, has a particularly high-profile element, amplifying the scrutiny and the stakes. As news of the arrest spread, media outlets worldwide began dissecting every detail, every photograph, every social media post, looking for hints, patterns, and clues to explain what happened. And then came the autopsy results, an element that would escalate the horror. The bodies were not just lifeless, they told a story. The wounds, the positioning, and the signs of struggle painted a picture that left even seasoned investigators uneasy. There were anomalies in the injuries, subtle details that suggested premeditation and familiarity, the kind of knowledge only someone close to the victims could possess. This is where the story takes its sharpest turn. The physical evidence, coupled with family dynamics, created a puzzle far more sinister than the initial police report suggested. Each revelation added complexity, and the audience watching from afar, people like you, began to realize that the truth was stranger, darker, and more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Public reaction has been immediate and intense. On social media platforms, theories range from tragic accident to calculated murder. Neighbors have come forward with their own suspicions, recounting previous conflicts or strange behaviors from members of the family. The Reiner household, once a symbol of prosperity and normalcy, has become a focal point of speculation, rumor, and fascination. And while the police maintain that the investigation is ongoing, the details that have leaked so far suggest a drama that reads more like fiction than reality. It's a case that challenges everything we assume about family loyalty, trust, and the hidden depths of human emotion. The media frenzy is understandable. Here we have a family of means, a violent and mysterious death, a son living on the premises, and a daughter who, knowingly or unknowingly, pointed the finger toward him. These are the elements that captivate audiences: wealth, betrayal, and tragedy combined with the intoxicating uncertainty of unanswered questions. Who was responsible? What drove them to commit such an act? Could there have been signs that were missed, warnings ignored, subtle red flags that, in hindsight, scream of impending disaster? And most importantly, how will the law interpret and prosecute a crime so intimate, so shocking, in a court of law that must balance evidence, motive, and the psychological complexity of family dynamics? As we dive deeper into this story, we will uncover details that few have yet heard. From the minute-by-minute reconstruction of that fateful day to the autopsy findings that revealed chilling truths, to the inner workings of the Reiner family and their guests, the story is filled with twists, emotional spikes, and revelations that keep unraveling. There are letters, digital footprints, witness testimonies, and subtle clues that, when pieced together, offer a picture of a family, a home, and a tragedy that no one saw coming. And as each new layer emerges, the narrative becomes both more intricate and more horrifying, leaving us to question, can a family ever truly know its own members? Or is the facade of trust sometimes just that, a fragile illusion waiting to be shattered? The stakes are monumental not just for the Reiners, but for the broader audience witnessing this tragedy. It is a cautionary tale, a chilling glimpse into how domestic spaces, wealth, and familiarity do not necessarily equate to safety. In fact, they can sometimes conceal the darkest human impulses. And this is where we begin to see the true gravity of the situation, the intersection of familial love, betrayal, wealth, and violence, each feeding into the next, creating a vortex of suspense and dread. What started as a quiet Sunday morning has become a case study in the fragility of trust and the volatility of human relationships. But perhaps the most unnerving question of all is this: how did it come to this? How did a family, presumably close-knit, with shared experiences and bonds, descend into a moment so catastrophic that it ended two lives and changed the course of everyone involved? And as authorities sift through the evidence, each revelation only deepens the mystery, challenging assumptions and confronting the audience with a truth that is as fascinating as it is terrifying. One thing is certain: the events of that Sunday will not be easily forgotten. They will haunt the minds of investigators, family members, and the public for years to come. And the details we will explore, some already uncovered, some still hidden, are crucial to understanding the full scope of this tragedy. By the end of this video, you will know more about the Reiners than anyone outside their family could possibly have imagined. You will hear about the chilling autopsy results, the strange clues left behind in the mansion, the police investigation, the shocking arrest of Nick Reiner, and the ripple effects this case has had on both the family and the public. You will also confront the uncomfortable reality that sometimes the people we trust most are capable of actions we cannot fathom. And yet, through it all, questions remain, suspense lingers, and the full story is still unfolding. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens when a normal Sunday morning turns into a scene of unthinkable tragedy? Picture the quiet streets of Brentwood, the soft hum of luxury cars, the distant laughter of neighbors enjoying the sun. And then, the silence is broken by a scream, sharp, piercing, impossible to ignore. For Romy Reiner, 27, this scream was not a distant sound. It was a personal alarm, a signal that her world had shifted forever. She had just stepped into the family estate, expecting the familiar embrace of home, and instead, she found something that no one should ever have to witness. The first thing Romy noticed was the stillness. It was more than quiet, It was an absence of life. Her parents, Rob and Michelle Reiner, were lying in the main hall, the vibrant energy that had once defined them replaced by silence, an unnatural stillness that made her chest tighten. Her heart raced, and a cold dread settled over her. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She tried to comprehend the impossible. How could both of her parents be gone, in the very home that had always been a sanctuary? Romy's mind raced. Was it a robbery? Was there an intruder still inside the house? Could someone have broken in without triggering the security system? And then, almost instinctively, she glanced toward the guest house. Her brother Nick, 32, lived there. Questions collided in her mind. Was he safe? Could he be involved? She had noticed, in the past months, moments of tension, small arguments that hinted at undercurrents beneath the surface of the seemingly perfect family life. But could any of that have escalated to this? The thought alone was unbearable. Police reports later detailed the timeline of that morning, reconstructing Romy's frantic calls and movements as she navigated the horrifying scene. But at that moment, there was no timeline, no procedure. Only the raw, gut-wrenching reality that her parents were dead. And yet, in the chaos, Romy displayed an almost superhuman clarity. She spoke to law enforcement, immediately mentioning a family member she considered dangerous and suggesting that he should be a suspect. For a daughter to point toward her own brother in such circumstances is almost unthinkable. It underscores the gravity of the tension and the darkness that had apparently been brewing beneath the surface for years. The crime scene itself was a grim tableau. Rob Reiner, 78, and Michelle, 70, had both suffered multiple stab wounds, precise yet frenzied, as if the attack were both methodical and deeply personal. The juxtaposition of their affluent surroundings and the violence inflicted within them struck investigators and the public alike. It is often said that wealth provides safety, but the Reiner case shatters that notion. The $13.5 million estate, a fortress of luxury, security, and comfort, became the very stage for unimaginable horror. Neighbors later described the morning as surreal. People went about their routines, unaware of the tragedy unfolding behind the tall hedges and security gates of the Reiner mansion. The contrast between ordinary life and the violent disruption within the estate created a jarring sense of disbelief. How could such a refined, private household conceal the potential for murder? This is a question that would haunt investigators, media outlets, and the public for weeks to come. Investigators quickly focused on the guest house where Nick Reiner lived. The reasoning was logical yet horrifying. Proximity to the crime scene, potential motive, and Romy's pointed warnings all directed suspicion inward, toward the family itself. In criminal investigations, it is often observed that the perpetrator is someone close to the victims, someone who understands their routines, their vulnerabilities, and their private spaces. The Reiner case fits this pattern all too well. It is a stark reminder that danger does not always come from the outside. Sometimes, it emerges from within, hidden in plain sight. But before any arrests could be made, Romy's actions and statements became central to the investigation. Her emotional state, understandably fragile, combined with her courage to report suspicions, created a critical turning point. Imagine the turmoil of a daughter simultaneously grappling with grief, shock, and the chilling awareness that a sibling might be responsible. How does one navigate such a storm? What is the emotional toll of pointing the finger at your own blood, while also mourning the parents who shaped your life? Romy's experience underscores the complexity and tragedy at the heart of this story. As forensic teams arrived, the scene was meticulously documented. Every detail mattered: the positioning of the bodies, the type of wounds, the presence or absence of defensive injuries, and any traces of struggle. Each observation told a piece of the story, hinting at both the method and the mind behind the crime. Preliminary assessments suggested a level of familiarity between the perpetrator and the victims. The intruder would have had to navigate the home confidently, bypassing alarms and security measures, or perhaps even disabling them. The chilling implication is clear: the murderer knew the house intimately. Authorities also noted anomalies that raised further questions. Certain rooms showed signs of disturbance, while others remained untouched, suggesting selective behavior. Objects were displaced in some areas, but left pristine in others. These subtleties pointed to a psychological profile that was both meticulous and emotionally charged. Whoever committed this act did so with knowledge, intention, and perhaps a deeply personal motive that investigators were just beginning to unravel. Meanwhile, the media began to converge on the story. Reporters highlighted the contrast between the Reiners' public image, successful, sophisticated, and loving, and the brutal reality revealed within their home. Headlines questioned how such a tragedy could occur and speculated about family tensions, financial disputes, or even hidden psychological disorders. Public fascination grew, driven by the combination of wealth, violence, and the possibility of intra-family betrayal. Social media amplified every rumor and every detail, creating a narrative that was part investigation, part spectacle. The investigation's early hours were fraught with tension. Officers had to secure the estate, interview family members, and begin collecting evidence, all while respecting the profound grief of those involved. The emotional stakes were immense. Imagine trying to focus on procedural accuracy while your heart aches for the family, and the possibility that someone you know is the killer looms over every decision. This was the reality facing law enforcement and forensic experts at the Reiner estate. And then there was the matter of motive, a question that would dominate headlines and courtroom speculation alike. Why would someone commit such a brutal act against the people who gave them life, care, and love? Was it financial gain, a long-simmering grudge, or a sudden, uncontrollable outburst of rage? Investigators began piecing together relationships, conversations, and behavioral patterns that might illuminate the path to that day's events. Each discovery added complexity, revealing that the tragedy was not a single moment, but the culmination of underlying tensions and hidden conflicts. The autopsy reports, which would later reveal startling details, were not yet public, but the crime scene alone offered hints of premeditation. The precision of the wounds, the order in which rooms were affected, and the absence of forced entry suggested intimate knowledge of the estate. These early observations fueled suspicion toward someone with access and familiarity. For many, this is the moment when fear turns inward, when the idea that danger could come from within a trusted circle becomes painfully real. Neighbors recalled seeing Nick Reiner around the estate that morning. Some noticed nothing unusual. Others reported brief, cryptic interactions that only later seemed significant. Investigators began to retrace his steps, searching for inconsistencies, hidden evidence, or any sign of preparation. Every minute detail mattered. Even the smallest behavioral cue could illuminate a path to understanding a crime that initially seemed inexplicable. And amidst the flurry of investigation, Romy's role remained central. She had witnessed the aftermath, pointed to a suspect, and now had to navigate the emotional minefield of family loyalty versus civic duty. Her courage in speaking up, despite the personal cost, provided authorities with a critical lead. But it also raised questions about the nature of familial bonds and how extreme situations can force impossible choices. What drives a sibling to suspect another? How does grief intersect with suspicion? These are questions without easy answers, and they deepen the tension as the story unfolds. By the end of that morning, the narrative had already shifted dramatically. What began as a shocking discovery had now evolved into a case of profound complexity, intertwining family dynamics, forensic science, and legal considerations. The stage was set for the arrest of Nick Reiner, the public unraveling of family secrets, and the eventual revelations of the autopsy that would stun even the most seasoned observers. And yet, even with the initial evidence in hand, investigators knew there was far more to uncover. The morning of horror had passed, but the real story was just beginning. The scene had been secured, statements had been taken, and the first threads of the narrative were emerging. Yet the public, investigators, and family members alike were all left with a haunting question. How could a family, seemingly ordinary and loving on the surface, harbor such devastating darkness? And as the investigation moved forward, the clues left behind would begin to point in a direction no one expected, setting the stage for revelations that would shock the world. Every family has secrets. Some are small, almost trivial. A hidden bank account, a lie told to protect feelings, a disagreement that is buried rather than aired. And then there are secrets that fester, grow, and metastasize into something far more dangerous. The Reiner family, outwardly successful, affluent, and picture-perfect, was no exception. On the surface, their lives were enviable: sprawling estates, financial security, public admiration. But beneath the polished veneer, tensions and conflicts simmered, waiting for the right, or wrong, moment to erupt. From the outside, the Reiners appeared to be the ideal family. Rob, at 78, had cultivated a reputation of sophistication, intelligence, and public respect. Michelle, 70, complimented him with her calm presence and nurturing demeanor. Together, they projected the image of stability and warmth. Friends and neighbors described the couple as welcoming, polite, and engaged in their community. Yet, appearances can be deceiving. Those who live closest to someone often see a different story: whispered arguments, subtle signs of resentment. And yet, despite these tensions, the Reiners maintained appearances. Friends and acquaintances consistently described a family that appeared close-knit, loving, and engaged. This duality, the contrast between public perception and private reality, is a common thread in high-profile domestic tragedies. It raises uncomfortable questions for observers. How much do we really know about the families we think we understand? How often do we see only the surface while missing the warning signs beneath? The Reiner case forces us to confront these questions in the most harrowing way. The morning of the tragedy, this complex family dynamic collided with a violent act that would forever alter the course of their lives. Romy, the observer and mediator, became the witness to both the outcome and the underlying patterns that had long existed. Her perspective offers a window into the household's private life. A life that, while seemingly ordinary, was interwoven with tension, subtle conflicts, and unresolved disputes. In the hours following her discovery, she would recount incidents, behaviors, and exchanges that painted a fuller picture of the Reiners' family life than anyone outside the household had ever known. Investigators would later describe the Reiner household as a house of contrasts. It was a home of luxury and comfort, of stability and order, yet beneath that veneer lurked conflict, resentment, and ultimately, the seeds of tragedy. Understanding this duality is crucial to comprehending how the events of that day could occur. The patterns of behavior, the simmering tensions, and the psychological dynamics all contributed to a situation where violence, though unimaginable to most, became possible. Neighbors, friends, and staff all reported that the Reiners were a family that valued appearances, yet behind closed doors, the dynamics were far more complex. Small arguments about chores or etiquette, disagreements over financial matters, and subtle power struggles all created an invisible web of tension. In many families, these threads are managed, diffused, or forgotten. In the Reiner household, for reasons still under investigation, these threads became tangled in a way that would culminate in tragedy. It is impossible to separate the personal from the structural, the psychological from the situational. The Reiners were wealthy, yes, but wealth alone does not prevent conflict. Indeed, in some cases, it intensifies it. The combination of autonomy, expectation, and interpersonal friction created a volatile environment. And on that fateful morning, all of these elements intersected in a moment of violence that shocked everyone who thought they knew the family. As the investigation continues, the focus on family dynamics remains central. Law enforcement and forensic psychologists are examining interactions, past conflicts, and behavioral patterns to understand the possible motives and triggers. Every argument, every disagreement, every subtle sign of tension is now a critical piece of the puzzle. And for the public, the unfolding story raises deeper questions about trust, loyalty, and the hidden lives of families who appear perfect from the outside. But just as the Reiner family's private tensions were coming into focus, investigators would soon uncover evidence suggesting that the tragedy was not merely the result of chance or escalation. There were deliberate actions, calculated steps, and signs that someone had planned or at least anticipated the outcome. These discoveries would turn the narrative from one of domestic tragedy to one of premeditated violence, revealing a depth of darkness within the household that no one could have imagined. And as the world would soon learn, the quiet veneer of the Reiner estate hid not only tension but also secrets, behaviors, and choices that set the stage for a crime so intimate, so devastating, that it would capture global attention. The story of the Reiners is not simply about a horrific act. It is about a family, its hidden struggles, and the moments when private conflicts erupt into public tragedy. But what came next would challenge everything we thought we knew about the family and reveal a shocking figure lurking in plain sight. Could someone you call brother really be capable of murder? The very question feels impossible, almost unthinkable. Yet, in the aftermath of the Reiner tragedy, it is the question that hung over every conversation, every headline, and every police report. At the center of this storm was Nick Reiner, 32, the son who lived in the guest house just steps from where his parents, Rob and Michelle, were found brutally stabbed. Understanding Nick, the man, the son, the potential perpetrator, is essential to unraveling this story. And as investigators began to peel back the layers of his life, a chilling portrait began to emerge. Nick was described by neighbors and acquaintances as intelligent, somewhat reserved, and independent-minded. Living in the guest house offered him a level of autonomy within the family estate, a physical and psychological separation from the main household. On the surface, this seemed ordinary, even reasonable. Many adult children live semi-independently with parents, especially in affluent families. But for Nick, this independence carried subtle undercurrents. A growing tension with his parents, occasional disagreements that escalated into harsh words, and a sense that he was being judged or controlled. These small fractures, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, created pressure points that may have festered over time. Friends of Nick painted a complicated picture. Some described him as charming and engaging, capable of warmth and humor. Others noticed a darker side, a streak of impatience, occasional temper flare-ups, and an intensity that could become overwhelming. Psychological experts often note that in cases of familial violence, these inconsistencies in personality can signal internal conflicts that, if left unchecked, may escalate into dangerous behaviors. Nick's case, investigators would later argue, fit this profile in unsettling ways. Financial independence, or the lack thereof, also played a role. Nick had access to family wealth, but was not entirely autonomous in his financial decisions. Questions of entitlement, perceived favoritism, and disagreements about inheritance or household contributions may have intensified tensions. In families of significant means, these disputes, while appearing minor to outsiders, can carry disproportionate emotional weight. When mixed with personality conflicts, unresolved resentments, and the proximity of daily interactions, the ingredients for catastrophe are, tragically, in place. And then there were the behavioral anomalies observed in the days and weeks leading up to the tragedy. Neighbors reported seeing Nick leave the guest house at unusual hours, sometimes returning late at night with an intensity in his demeanor that was unsettling. Staff members noted withdrawn behavior, moments of irritability, and, on rare occasions, unexplained absences. Each of these details, while individually innocuous, collectively formed a pattern that raised red flags once the investigation began. Nick's relationship with his parents was complex. He adored them at times, yet harbored frustration that may have stemmed from expectations, perceived criticism, or personal dissatisfaction. Rob, meticulous and precise, was known for his structured approach to life. Michelle, gentle but firm, maintained household equilibrium. For Nick, the constant balance between familial love and personal autonomy may have created psychological tension, a pressure that ultimately contributed to the tragic outcome. Experts often cite such dynamics in familial homicides. The intersection of affection, expectation, and resentment creates a volatile emotional environment. Police reports indicate that Nick's initial interactions with authorities were tense, but not immediately incriminating. He cooperated to an extent, but the subtle cues, the hesitation in responses, the inconsistencies in timelines, the guarded expressions, began to form a profile in investigators' minds. In criminal psychology, small behavioral deviations often serve as early indicators of potential involvement, especially when paired with circumstantial evidence. And then there was the guest house itself, a location that placed Nick in close physical proximity to the crime scene. Living just steps from where Rob and Michelle were found allowed for opportunity, and investigators immediately noted the strategic relevance of this positioning. In criminal cases, proximity often plays a pivotal role, not just logistically, but psychologically. The person living nearby knows the routines, the vulnerabilities, the timings, and the access points. This detail, innocuous to an outsider, became a critical piece of the puzzle. Nick's past social interactions were also scrutinized. Friends, acquaintances, and even distant colleagues were interviewed to establish behavioral patterns, social tendencies, and psychological profiles. Any anomalies, changes in behavior, sudden secrecy, unexplained absences were carefully noted. Experts emphasize that in high-profile domestic tragedies, the smallest overlooked behaviors often illuminate the broader narrative once violence occurs. Nick's life, as investigators reconstructed it, contained multiple such subtle anomalies. Perhaps most chilling were the psychological assessments conducted post-arrest. Experts began to analyze potential motives, including anger, jealousy, frustration, and feelings of inadequacy. Financial disputes, perceived slights, and unresolved tensions with his parents became key points of focus. While motive alone does not equate to guilt, understanding these psychological factors is essential in framing the investigation and anticipating potential patterns of behavior. Social media also played a role in shaping public perception of Nick. Accounts, posts, and interactions were reviewed to identify potential clues, ranging from expressions of frustration to subtle hints at dissatisfaction with family life. While social media can be misleading, it provides context, and in Nick's case, investigators found patterns that suggested internal conflict. These patterns, combined with physical evidence and witness accounts, began to coalesce into a narrative that was both compelling and disturbing. Yet, despite these mounting suspicions, Nick remained a human being at the center of a tragic storm. Loved by some, feared by others, and under scrutiny from authorities and the public alike, his life had been reduced to a series of questions. Could he have done it? Did he act out of anger, revenge, or desperation? Was this a crime of opportunity, a premeditated act, or something else entirely? Each question deepened the tension, leaving investigators and the public grappling with uncertainty. As law enforcement pieced together the timeline, inconsistencies began to emerge. Small gaps in alibis, minor discrepancies in accounts of movement, and subtle variations in statements painted a picture that demanded attention. In domestic homicide cases, these inconsistencies often signal underlying truths waiting to be revealed. Every detail was scrutinized, every statement dissected, and every piece of evidence was critical in building the narrative that would eventually lead to the arrest. The media frenzy surrounding Nick intensified as preliminary details leaked. Headlines questioned his temperament, past conflicts, and behavioral anomalies. Speculation ran rampant, from financial motives to psychological instability. Yet amid the speculation, a sobering truth remained. Nick was a family member, a son, and a brother, and the allegations against him struck at the core of familial trust. The notion that someone could commit such an act against the people who raised them is both horrifying and fascinating, challenging our assumptions about loyalty, morality, and the boundaries of human behavior. Investigators, however, maintained a methodical approach. Forensic evidence, digital footprints, and witness statements began converging to create a picture of Nick that was increasingly concerning. His proximity, behavioral patterns, and history of tension with his parents all contributed to a profile consistent with potential involvement. And yet, despite the mounting evidence, questions remained. Could this truly be a premeditated act? Was there an external influence, an unseen factor that drove the events of that morning? These uncertainties heightened the suspense, keeping both authorities and the public on edge. Psychologists and criminologists reviewing the case emphasized the importance of context. Domestic homicides, particularly those involving adult children, often stem from a confluence of factors: personal dissatisfaction, perceived injustices, psychological pressures, and opportunity. In Nick's case, the proximity of the guest house, prior behavioral patterns, and familial tension created a scenario where violence, while unthinkable to outsiders, became tragically possible. Understanding these elements is critical to comprehending the trajectory that led to the morning of horror. And so, Nick Reiner became the focal point, the shadow in the investigation. His life, previously seen through the lens of family normalcy, was now dissected, scrutinized, and analyzed from every angle. The questions were endless. What drove him? Did he plan this? Or was it the culmination of years of tension and frustration? Could anyone have predicted it? Or was this a tragedy waiting to happen, hidden behind the veneer of ordinary life? Each revelation added to the suspense, creating a story that gripped the public imagination and kept authorities racing to uncover the truth. But the most shocking detail was yet to emerge. Evidence from the estate and the forthcoming autopsy results would soon reveal a depth of premeditation and knowledge about the victim's routines that would leave investigators and the world in stunned disbelief. The shadows surrounding Nick Reiner were only beginning to take shape, and the coming revelations would force everyone to confront a terrifying possibility that someone they loved could be capable of unthinkable violence. And what came next would turn suspicion into certainty, and no one saw it coming. What does a crime scene reveal that words alone cannot capture? Sometimes, the walls themselves whisper the story, the arrangement of objects, the signs of struggle, and the details left behind, all painting a picture that investigators and the public struggle to comprehend. The Reiner estate, a sprawling $13.5 million mansion in Brentwood, was no exception. Within its carefully curated rooms, the horror of that Sunday morning left marks that would haunt those who entered for years to come. From the outside, the mansion projected elegance and order. Manicured lawns, high walls, and polished windows gave the impression of perfection. But behind those walls, chaos had erupted. Law enforcement officers who first entered the property described a scene both meticulously detailed and grotesquely disturbing. Rob and Michelle Reiner had been brutally stabbed, the wounds precise yet ferocious, suggesting a combination of rage, skill, and intimate knowledge of their routines. Each injury told a part of the story that words alone could not explain. The main hallway, where both victims were found, became the focal point of investigators' initial efforts. Blood spatter patterns indicated struggle and resistance. Yet the positioning of the bodies also suggested moments of control, subtle but telling clues that spoke volumes about the perpetrator's relationship to the victims. Investigators noted that certain defensive wounds were absent, an anomaly that suggested the victims were caught off guard, familiar with the attacker, or incapacitated in a manner consistent with someone who had knowledge of their habits and vulnerabilities. Every room of the mansion was meticulously examined. Bedrooms, offices, and common areas revealed subtle disturbances. A chair slightly moved, a personal item out of place, a door left ajar. These details, seemingly minor, provided critical insight into the timeline and sequence of events. Forensic teams documented everything in photographs, notes, and measurements, understanding that even the smallest detail could pivot the investigation. In high-profile domestic cases, investigators often rely on these nuances to reconstruct the narrative, and in the Reiner case, the mansion itself became a silent witness to unspeakable violence. The guest house, home to Nick Reiner, was also scrutinized. Investigators sought signs of premeditation, planning, or behavioral anomalies that could connect him to the crime. The proximity of the guest house to the main mansion allowed for opportunity and access, a critical point in constructing the timeline. The forensic team meticulously mapped entry and exit points, examining doors, windows, and security systems to determine if the perpetrator moved freely or had to navigate obstacles. The patterns of movement within the estate hinted at familiarity and confidence, reinforcing suspicions that the crime was committed by someone within the household. Investigators also paid close attention to items within reach of the victims. Knives, scissors, and other potential weapons were accounted for. Forensic analysis would later confirm which implements were used, but at the scene, their positioning provided immediate clues. In domestic homicides, the choice of weapon often reveals emotional context. Sharp, intimate instruments like knives can suggest personal anger and deliberate targeting. In the Reiner case, the tools used were consistent with an attack carried out by someone with access, familiarity, and intent. Another unsettling detail was the relative order in some parts of the home. Certain rooms remained untouched, personal effects untouched, books in place. This contrast between chaos and calm hinted at deliberate selection, indicating that the perpetrator knew which areas to disturb and which to leave pristine. These seemingly small patterns became pivotal in constructing the psychological profile of the individual responsible. It was as if the house itself was a canvas, each mark a stroke revealing intent, knowledge, and motive. As for digital evidence, investigators immediately seized computers, smartphones, and other devices. Every device, every email, every message became a potential clue. They looked for evidence of communication between Nick and others, search histories, social media interactions, and anything that could provide insight into his state of mind. In modern investigations, digital footprints are often as telling as physical evidence, revealing intentions, plans, and sometimes premeditation. In the Reiner estate, this layer of investigation would soon yield information as chilling as what the physical scene suggested. Neighbors and onlookers, arriving later in the day, described a surreal atmosphere. The property, normally a site of quiet luxury, was now swarming with law enforcement, forensic teams, and media personnel. Police tape cordoned off the perimeter, helicopters hovered above, and reporters scrambled to capture every detail. The contrast between everyday life and the violent intrusion into the Reiners' home created a sense of disbelief that permeated the surrounding community. How could such violence erupt in a place that, on the surface, seemed secure, orderly, and calm? The investigators' task was compounded by the presence of family members and friends, whose grief, shock, and confusion sometimes blurred lines between witness and participant. Every subsequent investigation, interview, and forensic analysis would revolve around this crime scene. The Reiner mansion was no longer just a home. It was a repository of secrets, a canvas of violence, and a central character in a story of familial betrayal. From the main house to the guest house, every corner held clues that would later reveal the horrifying reality that someone who lived within these walls was capable of unimaginable violence. And as investigators dug deeper, one fact became increasingly clear. The mansion was hiding more than just the physical evidence of a crime. It concealed behavioral patterns, relationships, and psychological nuances that would point directly to the perpetrator. Every door, every corridor, and every room had a story to tell, one that would shock everyone once it was finally pieced together. But what came next would reveal the most shocking detail of all. Evidence that turned suspicion into undeniable implication, and no one could have predicted the revelations that followed. What can a body tell us when words fail? In the aftermath of the Reiner tragedy, the autopsy reports promised to reveal the most chilling and intimate truths about that horrific morning. Rob and Michelle Reiner, once vibrant and full of life, were now silent messengers of the violence that had erupted in their home. Every wound, every mark, and every detail of their final moments would provide investigators, and the world, with critical insight into not only how they died, but who could have done it. The first autopsy report, while technical, painted a picture that was both precise and terrifying. Rob Reiner, 78, had suffered multiple stab wounds, concentrated on vital areas, indicating an understanding of anatomy and lethality. The nature of the wounds suggested a combination of rage and calculation, an odd juxtaposition that left forensic experts uneasy. Michelle, 70, had injuries that mirrored those of her husband, yet with subtle differences that hinted at her attempts to shield or protect herself during the attack. The juxtaposition of their wounds suggested a sequence and strategy, an awareness of vulnerability, and a personal familiarity with their assailant. Forensic pathologists noted that the angle and depth of the wounds indicated close-range attacks. This was not a random act of violence perpetrated by a stranger at the periphery of the estate. The precision and proximity implied intimate knowledge of the victim's positions and likely daily routines. Each wound was a data point, a line in a story that investigators were slowly decoding. And the more they examined, the more it became clear that the attacker knew the victims personally, possibly in ways that even family members struggled to comprehend. The autopsy also revealed defensive wounds, or rather, the lack thereof. In typical violent encounters, victims often sustain injuries while attempting to defend themselves. Cuts on hands, bruises from resistance, marks indicating struggle. In this case, however, the defensive injuries were minimal, suggesting that the victims were caught off guard or incapacitated quickly. This anomaly raised further questions. Did the assailant plan the attack meticulously? Did they understand how to neutralize their targets efficiently? Each unanswered question intensified the sense of foreboding surrounding the investigation. Another disturbing detail emerged in the pattern of injuries. Certain wounds were concentrated in areas that would incapacitate movement almost immediately, indicating knowledge not just of anatomy, but of human behavior under stress. Forensic experts emphasize that such detail is rare in domestic homicides. It typically points to either premeditation or a deep familiarity with the victims. The notion that a family member, someone who shared the victim's daily life, could execute an attack with such precision sent shockwaves through both the investigative team and the broader public. Beyond the physical wounds, toxicology reports added another layer to the narrative. While no substances were found that could have impaired judgment, the presence or absence of certain medications provided context for how quickly events unfolded. Both Rob and Michelle had been in relatively stable health, which made the suddenness of the attack all the more horrifying. For investigators, the absence of complicating factors meant that the assailant had executed a plan with alarming efficiency. This was not chaos. It was control wielded with intimate knowledge of the household. Behavioral analysts reviewing the autopsy results highlighted something even more disturbing: the sequence of attacks. Evidence suggested that the assailant targeted Rob first, then Michelle, implying awareness of their locations and routines. This sequencing aligns with reports from the crime scene, where officers noted order amidst chaos, specific areas disturbed, others left untouched. Such patterns indicate both familiarity and deliberation, pointing away from a random act of violence and toward a perpetrator who understood the dynamics of the household. Investigators also paid attention to subtle clues about struggle and resistance. While both victims had some evidence of defensive action, the minimal resistance suggested surprise, shock, or even trust in the attacker. This is often observed in cases where the perpetrator is known to the victims, someone whose presence might not immediately trigger alarm. The psychological implications are chilling. The Reiners may have allowed proximity to someone they trusted or thought they could trust, only to fall victim to violence from within. As the autopsy reports circulated among law enforcement and forensic teams, certain experts began drawing preliminary conclusions. The nature of the wounds, the sequence of attacks, and the precision indicated a high likelihood of familial involvement. The details matched patterns seen in rare but documented cases of intra-family homicide, where adult children, motivated by rage, entitlement, or psychological distress, commit acts of extreme violence. While motive remained to be fully determined, the physical evidence was damning in its clarity. Someone inside the home, someone with knowledge of the Reiners' routines and vulnerabilities, was responsible. But perhaps the most unsettling revelation was a detail that emerged in Michelle's injuries. Forensic pathologists noted subtle patterns indicating she may have attempted to protect Rob during the attack, an instinctive and human response that underscores the intimacy and horror of the crime. This wasn't merely a violent encounter. It was a confrontation between a family member and the people who loved them, revealing the complex psychological dimensions of familial betrayal. The act was personal, and the physical evidence underscored the human cost in a way that would resonate with investigators and the public alike. Digital evidence corroborated some of the autopsy insights. Logs from smart devices, security cameras, and other digital footprints indicated movement patterns that matched the timing suggested by the injuries. Investigators began piecing together minute-by-minute reconstructions, noting where the assailant had moved, how the victims responded, and how the sequence of events unfolded. The combination of physical and digital evidence painted a picture that was both precise and terrifying. The perpetrator moved through the household with knowledge, intention, and deadly efficiency. Family psychologists reviewing the case noted a disturbing alignment between the behavioral profile suggested by the autopsy and known tensions within the household. In families under pressure, whether due to wealth, expectations, or interpersonal conflict, latent resentments can sometimes erupt into violence. The Reiner's case fit this pattern in an extreme and tragic way. Every wound, every mark, every anomaly in the autopsy was a piece of the puzzle pointing toward someone deeply embedded in the family's daily life. Media outlets quickly picked up on the autopsy details, though in a heavily redacted form. Headlines hinted at precision, premeditation, and intimate knowledge, sparking speculation about familial involvement. Social media conversations erupted, blending fact with rumor, creating a storm of public fascination and horror. The autopsy, while technical, became a narrative device that framed the tragedy not just as a domestic homicide, but as a story of betrayal, trust broken, and the terrifying possibility that someone close to the victims had committed the act. As investigators continued their analysis, they focused on linking the autopsy findings with behavioral patterns. The wound's precision, the sequence of attacks, and the minimal defensive response suggested that the perpetrator had planned, anticipated, and executed the act in a calculated manner. Combined with prior knowledge of the victim's routines, access points, and domestic habits, the evidence pointed increasingly toward Nick Reiner, the son living within the guest house. Each revelation tightened the net, bringing clarity to a scenario that, at first glance, seemed incomprehensible. The emotional impact of the autopsy findings cannot be overstated. For Romy, and for anyone close to the family, the details provided both answers and deeper horror. It confirmed that the deaths were violent, intimate, and deliberate. It revealed that the tragedy had not been a moment of random chaos, but the culmination of forces that had built up over time, possibly including resentment, frustration, and personal conflict. The autopsy transformed abstract suspicion into tangible, horrifying reality. And as forensic teams prepared to release further details, one fact became undeniable. The person responsible had operated with knowledge, familiarity, and intention. The autopsy didn't just confirm death, it illuminated the pathway to that death, the choices made, and the intimate betrayal that lay at the heart of the Reiner tragedy. But what came next would push the investigation even further, revealing testimony that left law enforcement questioning everything, and shining a light on a family secret nobody saw coming. How does a daughter confront the possibility that the person she grew up with, her own brother, could be responsible for the murder of her parents? Romy Reiner, 27, faced the kind of moral and emotional storm that most of us can scarcely imagine. The moment she discovered her parents' bodies, her world shifted from ordinary life to unthinkable tragedy. She became both witness and participant, the first person on the scene, and an involuntary key to unlocking a mystery that would captivate the nation. Romy's initial reaction was visceral. Shock, fear, and grief collided in a way that rendered her momentarily paralyzed. Her eyes fell on the lifeless forms of Rob and Michelle Reiner, and in that instant, the familiar contours of home transformed into a scene of horror. Every detail, the stillness of the hallway, the displaced furniture, the faint metallic smell, etched itself into her memory. Yet amid the chaos, Romy displayed remarkable presence of mind. She reached for her phone, called emergency services, and provided law enforcement with information that would immediately shape the investigation. Her testimony would later reveal a critical, haunting insight, a suspicion, almost instinctive, about a family member's potential involvement. "There's someone dangerous in the house," she reportedly told authorities. "He should be considered a suspect." For a daughter to point toward her own brother is almost unthinkable, yet Romy's observations were grounded in subtle patterns she had noticed over time. Behavioral cues, private arguments, and perhaps an underlying tension within the family all informed her perception of danger. This was not a snap judgment. It was a reflection of long-held awareness, now tragically confirmed by circumstance. Romy recounted the moments leading up to her discovery with stark detail. She described walking through the estate, expecting the usual tranquility, and then being confronted by the horror in the main hallway. She spoke of trying to process what she was seeing, her mind racing to make sense of the scene, while simultaneously protecting herself from panic. Investigators later noted that her description of her parents' positions, the state of the rooms, and the details of the blood spatter were remarkably precise, suggesting that she had carefully observed the scene even under intense emotional stress. Her statements also highlighted the complexity of family dynamics within the Reiner household. Romy revealed moments of tension she had witnessed between Nick and their parents, small arguments, and subtle signs of frustration or defiance. While these incidents might have seemed minor to outsiders, Romy's perspective underscored that familial relationships are often multi-layered, with grievances, resentments, and unspoken conflicts simmering beneath the surface. Her testimony would later become a cornerstone for investigators seeking to understand motive and context. Psychologists analyzing Romy's account emphasized the difficulty of her position. She was tasked with reconciling grief, shock, and potential suspicion against her own sibling. The cognitive dissonance inherent in such a situation is profound. How does one balance loyalty, love, and familial bond with the duty to provide accurate, truthful information to law enforcement? Romy's courage in speaking out, despite the personal cost, was extraordinary and underscored the human complexity of domestic tragedies. In addition to her emotional testimony, Romy provided concrete observational details that guided the investigation. She noted the placement of objects, the condition of the rooms, and the sequence of events as she perceived them. She described how certain items appeared disturbed while others remained untouched, a detail that aligned with forensic evidence collected later. Investigators relied heavily on her recollections to begin reconstructing the timeline and understanding the perpetrator's movements within the home. The media seized upon Romy's role almost immediately. Headlines emphasized the chilling notion of a daughter pointing suspicion at her brother, framing the narrative in terms of betrayal, tragedy, and the shocking unraveling of family life. While sensationalized, these reports highlighted the centrality of Romy's observations in the unfolding story. Her perspective provided a human lens through which the public could begin to comprehend the unimaginable violence that had occurred within the Reiner estate. But Romy's testimony also hinted at subtler, more disturbing elements. She described moments of unusual behavior by Nick in the weeks leading up to the tragedy, withdrawn actions, cryptic comments, sudden bursts of anger, and occasional tension that seemed disproportionate. While these observations may have seemed minor at the time, they gained profound significance in the context of the crime. Investigators noted that her account aligned with other patterns of behavior, creating a cohesive narrative that suggested premeditation and psychological tension. Romy's willingness to speak candidly was not without risk. In cases of domestic homicide, family members often struggle with feelings of guilt, responsibility, and conflict over loyalties. By pointing to her brother, Romy exposed herself to public scrutiny, media attention, and emotional backlash from other family members or acquaintances. Yet her testimony was clear, detailed, and unwavering. It became a critical element in building the case against Nick, providing both context and concrete observations that supported the physical and digital evidence being collected by law enforcement. Her recounting of the initial discovery also provided insight into the psychological impact of sudden trauma. She described moments of disbelief, shock, and fleeting denial, followed by a drive to act, to contact authorities, preserve evidence, and provide accurate information. This dual response, combining intense emotional reaction with methodical action, is often noted by psychologists as characteristic of individuals who become key witnesses in traumatic events. Romy's ability to navigate this balance made her testimony invaluable. In the days following the discovery, Romy continued to work with investigators, providing supplementary details, clarifying timelines, and answering questions about family dynamics. She recounted incidents of prior tension between Nick and their parents, sometimes minor, sometimes more significant, offering insight into the psychological environment of the household. Her observations painted a picture of a family in which unresolved conflicts, subtle resentments, and complex interpersonal dynamics coexisted with love, respect, and shared history, a duality that made the tragedy all the more shocking. Behavioral analysts would later highlight how Romy's testimony aligned with patterns seen in familial homicides. Witnesses often report subtle behavioral shifts, signs of escalating tension, and prior conflicts that seem insignificant at the time but, in retrospect, foreshadow catastrophic events. Romy's detailed recollection of these small but critical details provided investigators with a roadmap for understanding motive, opportunity, and the psychological climate that contributed to the tragedy. The impact of her testimony on the investigation cannot be overstated. Romy provided the first direct linkage between observed family tensions and the crime itself. Her insights allowed investigators to narrow their focus, assess risk factors, and consider potential psychological triggers. In combination with forensic evidence, digital data, and behavioral analysis, her testimony became a central pillar supporting the case against Nick Reiner. Yet even as investigators relied on her observations, new questions arose. Could she have missed subtle cues? Were there aspects of the family dynamic she hadn't observed? How much did grief shape her perceptions of events and behaviors? These questions added complexity to the investigation, requiring careful cross-examination, corroboration with evidence, and ongoing analysis to ensure accuracy and reliability. As the investigation progressed, Romy's role continued to evolve. She became both witness and informant, providing insight into household dynamics, past incidents, and interactions that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Her testimony would later reveal patterns of behavior, potential motives, and subtle conflicts that painted a more complete, if chilling, picture of the Reiner household. And as the public absorbed each revelation, one truth became undeniable. Romy's courage, clarity, and attention to detail had illuminated a dark path that investigators would follow, a path that pointed increasingly toward Nick Reiner as the individual at the center of the tragedy. But what came next would bring the full weight of the law crashing down, as evidence and testimony converged to change suspicion into arrest, and no one could have predicted the intensity of what followed. When does suspicion become certainty? When does investigation cross the line into action? For Nick Reiner, 32, the morning of his arrest marked the moment where the shadows of suspicion became inescapable reality. The culmination of forensic evidence, witness testimony, and behavioral analysis had pointed investigators in a single direction. Yet, even as authorities prepared to act, the weight of the decision was immense, arresting a son, a family member, a human being tied to the victims by blood, history, and love. The tension surrounding that moment was palpable, both inside the Reiner estate and across the media.